A carpenter's son from Nazareth walks into the Jerusalem temple, overturns the money changers' tables, and declares his father's house is not a marketplace. 2,000 years later, that same man's face adorns everything from coffee mugs to cryptocurrency logos, while megachurches broadcast prosperity gospel to millions, and corporate executives quote the Sermon on the Mount in boardroom presentations. The irony is staggering. Jesus of Nazareth, a man who told his followers to sell everything and give to the poor, has become the unwitting patron saint of the world's most powerful economic system. His teachings have been twisted, cherry-picked, and repackaged to justify everything from sweatshop labor to predatory lending. But what would the historical Jesus actually think about our modern capitalist world? The answer is far more complex and disturbing than you might imagine. In first-century Palestine, economic inequality wasn't an abstract concept debated in policy papers. It was a brutal reality that crushed entire populations under the weight of imperial taxation and debt slavery. The Roman Empire had perfected a system that would make modern corporations jealous, extract maximum wealth from conquered territories while providing just enough stability to prevent total collapse. Consider this. When Jesus walked the dusty roads of Galilee, approximately 90% of the population lived at or below subsistence level. The vast majority were peasant farmers who owned no land, worked plots owned by wealthy elites, and were taxed by both Rome and local puppet rulers like Herod Antipas. Many families lost their ancestral lands to debt and were forced into day labor, exactly the kind of workers Jesus described in his parable of the vineyard, standing idle in the marketplace because no one had hired them. This wasn't just poverty, this was systematic economic oppression designed to funnel wealth upward to a tiny elite. Sound familiar? But here's where the story takes its first surprising turn. Jesus wasn't just another peasant complaining about hard times. He was literate, unusual for someone of his social class, and demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of economic systems that scholars are only beginning to appreciate. When he told parables about shrewd managers, unforgiving creditors, and day laborers, he wasn't speaking in abstract metaphors. He was dissecting the economic machinery that dominated every aspect of daily life. Take the parable of the workers in the vineyard, where laborers hired at different times all receive the same wage. Modern capitalists often interpret this as a lesson about God's grace being equally available to all, but economic historians see something different. A radical critique of market-based wage determination. Jesus is suggesting that human dignity and basic needs should trump market efficiency, a position that would make any Wall Street executive break out in cold sweats. The plot thickens when we examine Jesus' most famous economic encounter, the cleansing of the temple. Popular Christian culture has sanitized this into a gentle lesson about keeping sacred spaces pure. The historical reality was far more explosive. Jesus wasn't just upset about religious commercialization. He was launching a direct attack on the economic heart of the Jerusalem establishment. The temple wasn't just a place of worship, it was the central bank of ancient Judaism. The money changers Jesus confronted weren't small-time hustlers skimming a few coins. They were part of a sophisticated financial system that converted Roman currency into temple-acceptable silver, charging exchange rates that would make modern predatory lenders blush. The temple treasury held enormous wealth, much of it extracted from poor pilgrims who could barely afford the journey to Jerusalem, let alone the required sacrificial animals sold at monopoly prices. When Jesus overturned those tables, he was essentially storming the Federal Reserve while declaring that the entire monetary system was corrupt. This wasn't a religious protest, it was economic terrorism, first century style. But here's the detail that most people miss. Jesus didn't just criticize the system and walk away. He offered a radical alternative that would make both modern socialists and capitalists deeply uncomfortable. "Sell everything you have and give to the poor," he told the rich young ruler. "It is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to enter the kingdom of God," he declared to his stunned disciples. "Do not store up treasures on earth," he commanded in the Sermon on the Mount. These weren't gentle suggestions for charitable giving. They were revolutionary prescriptions for completely dismantling the economic order. Yet the historical Jesus wasn't advocating for state socialism or centralized redistribution. His solution was even more radical: voluntary communalism based on love rather than law. The early Christian communities described in Acts shared everything in common, but not because of government mandate, because they genuinely believed that private property was incompatible with following Christ. No one said that any of their possessions was their own, Acts records, but they shared everything they had. This wasn't hippie idealism. It was a functioning economic system that sustained thousands of believers across the Roman Empire for decades. Now, before you start thinking, this proves Jesus was a proto-communist, consider this fascinating twist. The early Christian economy was built on an assumption that would horrify modern progressives. It assumed that most human economic activity was fundamentally corrupted by sin, and that the only solution was to opt out entirely. Jesus didn't believe in reforming capitalism or socialism. He believed in transcending economics altogether. His kingdom wasn't about creating a more equitable distribution of wealth. It was about recognizing that the pursuit of wealth itself was a spiritual disease. This brings us to one of history's greatest ironies. As Christianity spread throughout the Roman Empire, it began attracting wealthy converts who were unwilling to sell everything but still wanted to follow Jesus. Rather than abandon their faith, they began reinterpreting Christ's teachings to accommodate their economic interests. By the 4th century, when Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity, the Church had developed elaborate theological justifications for wealth accumulation. Suddenly, Jesus' clear commands about giving up possessions became spiritual metaphors, rather than literal instructions. The camel and the needle's eye became a small gate in Jerusalem that camels could squeeze through if they were unloaded. A convenient interpretation that has zero historical basis, but allows rich Christians to sleep better at night. Augustine of Hippo, one of Christianity's most influential theologians, wrestled with this tension throughout his career. He owned property, accepted donations, and lived comfortably while teaching that earthly attachments were dangerous. His solution? Distinguish between use and enjoyment of material goods. Christians could possess wealth as long as they didn't find their ultimate happiness in it. This intellectual sleight of hand opened the floodgates. Within centuries, the Church itself became one of Europe's largest landowners and creditors. Monasteries operated profitable farms, churches charged fees for services, and the Vatican developed sophisticated banking relationships with merchant families like the Medicis. The Protestant Reformation, which many assume brought Christianity back to its economic roots, actually accelerated this process. John Calvin, the influential Geneva reformer, explicitly rejected the Catholic prohibition on charging interest, arguing that moderate profit from lending was acceptable. This theological shift provided crucial religious cover for the emerging capitalist economy. Max Weber famously argued that Protestant work ethic became the cultural foundation for modern capitalism. But Weber missed something crucial. The Protestant reformers weren't trying to create capitalism. They were trying to solve the same theological problem Augustine faced centuries earlier. How do you follow Jesus' teachings about wealth while participating in an economy that requires wealth accumulation? Their solution was even more ingenious than Augustine's. Rather than seeing wealth as spiritually dangerous, Protestants began viewing economic success as a sign of God's blessing. Suddenly, making money wasn't just permissible. It was a religious duty. The prosperity gospel was born centuries before anyone called it that. This theological transformation had enormous historical consequences. When European Christians began colonizing the Americas, they brought both Bibles and business plans. They justified enslaving Africans and genociding indigenous populations, partly through economic theology that portrayed wealth accumulation as divine mandate. Consider the Dutch Reformed Church's role in early capitalist development. Dutch Calvinist merchants pioneered many modern financial instruments: joint stock companies, commodity futures, marine insurance, while maintaining that their business activities were forms of Christian service. They created the world's first stock exchange while singing hymns about following Jesus. The British later perfected this combination of Christian rhetoric and capitalist practice. When the East India Company was extracting enormous wealth from India, its directors regularly attended Anglican services and funded missionary activities. They saw no contradiction between following Christ and creating one of history's most exploitative economic systems. American Christianity took this synthesis even further. Puritan settlers believed their economic success in the New World proved God's special favor. Later, during the Industrial Revolution, Christian business owners like Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller developed gospel of wealth theologies that portrayed extreme inequality as part of God's plan. Carnegie, one of history's richest individuals, wrote extensively about how wealthy Christians had a moral obligation to accumulate as much money as possible so they could give it away more effectively. This conveniently ignored Jesus' specific instruction to the rich young ruler to sell everything immediately rather than build wealth first and philanthropize later. But here's where our story takes another unexpected turn. While mainstream Christianity was busy baptizing capitalism, small groups of believers kept trying to live according to Jesus' actual economic teachings. The Anabaptists, persecuted by both Catholics and Protestants, maintained communal ownership of property and refused to participate in profit-driven commerce. The Hutterites, a branch of Anabaptism, created sustainable communal economies that have lasted over 400 years, longer than any capitalist corporation. During the Industrial Revolution, Christian socialists like Dorothy Day and the Catholic worker movement created alternative economic communities based on voluntary poverty and service to the marginalized. Day, who fed and housed thousands of poor people while living in deliberate poverty herself, once said, "The mystery of the poor is this, that they are Jesus." These movements never achieved mainstream success, but they preserved something crucial: a living memory of what Christian economics might look like if taken seriously. So what would Jesus actually think about modern capitalism? The historical evidence suggests he would view it much like he viewed the temple money changers, as a system that exploits the poor to enrich the wealthy while using religious language to justify the exploitation. Modern capitalism shares several features with the Roman imperial economy that Jesus consistently opposed. It concentrates wealth among a small elite while leaving vast populations struggling to meet basic needs. It turns essential goods, housing, healthcare, education, into profit centers rather than guaranteed rights. It requires endless growth on a finite planet, ignoring long-term consequences for short-term gains. Perhaps most troubling from a Christian perspective, modern capitalism treats human labor as just another commodity to be bought and sold at market prices. When companies lay off thousands of workers to boost quarterly profits, they're operating on the assumption that human beings are expendable resources rather than image bearers of God. Consider Amazon, one of the world's most valuable companies. Its founder, Jeff Bezos, accumulated wealth faster than any person in human history, while his warehouse workers struggled to afford basic healthcare and were disciplined for taking bathroom breaks. The company's business model depends on extracting maximum value from human labor while providing minimum compensation, precisely the kind of economic relationship Jesus consistently condemned. Or examine the pharmaceutical industry, where companies regularly charge desperate patients thousands of dollars for medications that cost pennies to produce. Martin Shkreli became a symbol of this practice when he raised the price of a life-saving drug by over 5,000% overnight. But he was simply following standard industry logic. Charge whatever the market will bear, regardless of human suffering. These aren't aberrations within capitalism. They're features of a system designed to maximize return on investment rather than human welfare. But perhaps the most damning evidence comes from capitalism's environmental impact. Jesus taught that humans are stewards of God's creation, responsible for caring for the natural world rather than exploiting it. Modern capitalism has created the first human economic system capable of destroying the planet's life support systems in pursuit of short-term profits. Climate change, caused primarily by fossil fuel companies that knew about the environmental consequences decades before taking action, represents the ultimate collision between Jesus' teachings and capitalist logic. When ExxonMobil's own scientists documented climate risks in the 1970s, but the company chose to fund climate denial rather than transition to clean energy, They demonstrated capitalism's fundamental inability to prioritize long-term human welfare over immediate profits. Hey, quick question. Where in the world are you watching this from right now? Drop your location and what time it is in the comments. I'm genuinely curious about our global audience here at Professor Archive. And if you're enjoying this deep dive into one of history's most fascinating contradictions, a super thanks really helps keep these research-heavy videos coming. Now, supporters of capitalism often point to its success in reducing absolute poverty and increasing global living standards. These arguments deserve serious consideration, but they miss something crucial about Jesus' economic vision. Jesus wasn't primarily concerned with increasing overall wealth or even reducing absolute poverty. He was concerned with relationships, specifically how economic systems affect the relationships between human beings and between humans and God. From this perspective, capitalism's greatest failing isn't that it's inefficient at creating wealth. It's that it systematically corrupts human relationships by turning them into market transactions. When healthcare becomes a commodity sold to the highest bidder, the relationship between healer and patient is fundamentally altered. When education becomes a luxury good available only to those who can afford it, the relationship between teacher and student is corrupted by debt and class distinction. When housing becomes primarily an investment vehicle rather than a human right, the basic relationship between people and place is distorted by speculation and profit-seeking. Jesus' alternative vision, voluntary communalism based on love, offers a radically different approach to human economic relationships. Instead of competition for scarce resources, it assumes abundance through sharing. Instead of individual accumulation, it emphasizes collective welfare. Instead of market-based allocation, it prioritizes need-based distribution. This might sound impossibly utopian, but scattered examples throughout history demonstrate its practical viability. The early Christian communities sustained themselves for decades using these principles. Modern communities like the Bruderhof, kibbutzim in Israel, and various eco-villages have created functioning economies based on cooperation rather than competition. Even within capitalist societies, the most successful and sustainable institutions often operate on principles closer to Jesus' teachings than to pure market logic. Universities, hospitals, libraries, and fire departments function primarily as service organizations rather than profit centers. Families share resources based on love and obligation rather than market exchange. Voluntary organizations mobilize enormous resources through donated time and money rather than wage labor and capital investment. The question isn't whether alternatives to capitalism are possible. It's whether they're scalable and whether enough people are willing to embrace the radical personal transformation that Jesus' economic vision requires. This brings us to perhaps the most uncomfortable truth about Jesus and capitalism. His economic teachings can't be separated from his spiritual teachings. You can't follow Jesus' instructions about money while ignoring his instructions about worship, forgiveness, and self-sacrifice. Modern attempts to create Christian capitalism or ethical business practices often miss this fundamental point. Jesus didn't offer tips for being a more generous capitalist. He offered a completely different way of understanding human purpose and relationships. When Jesus told his followers to seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, he was providing the foundational principle for all economic activity. Everything else, production, distribution, consumption, investment, should flow from this primary commitment to God's justice and mercy. Capitalism, even in its most humane forms, operates on the assumption that individual self-interest, mediated through market mechanisms, will produce the greatest good for the greatest number. This assumption directly contradicts Jesus' teaching that the greatest commandments are to love God completely and love your neighbor as yourself. The conflict isn't just theoretical. When companies are legally required to maximize shareholder value, they literally cannot prioritize neighbor love over profit maximization without violating their fiduciary duties. When individual workers compete for jobs in a labor market, they cannot fully love their competitors without undermining their own economic security. These structural contradictions explain why well-meaning Christians within capitalist systems often find themselves trapped between their economic interests and their spiritual convictions. They're trying to serve two masters, God and Mammon, which Jesus explicitly said was impossible. So, what would a genuinely Christian economy look like in the modern world? The answer requires imagination, courage, and a willingness to take Jesus' teachings seriously rather than explaining them away. It might begin with local communities that prioritize mutual aid over market exchange. Instead of competing for resources, neighbors could pool their skills, tools, and knowledge to meet everyone's basic needs. This isn't just theoretical. Mutual aid networks in cities like Detroit and New Orleans have demonstrated how communities can provide healthcare, education, housing assistance, and food security through cooperation rather than cash transactions. It might include worker-owned cooperatives that distribute both decision-making power and economic benefits among all participants, rather than concentrating them among capital owners. The Mondragon Corporation in Spain, one of the world's largest cooperative networks, has demonstrated that large-scale economic activity can operate on principles of solidarity and democratic participation, rather than hierarchical command and profit extraction. It might involve land trusts and community ownership models that remove essential resources like housing and farmland from speculative markets while ensuring long-term stewardship. Organizations like the Community Land Trust movement have shown how communities can maintain affordable housing and sustainable agriculture without relying on private property markets. Most radically, it might require abandoning the assumption that human welfare depends on endless economic growth. Jesus' teaching about the lilies of the field suggests a very different approach. Trust that God's creation provides sufficient resources for all creatures when those resources aren't hoarded by some at the expense of others. This doesn't mean returning to pre-industrial poverty. It means using modern technology and organizational knowledge to create abundance through sharing rather than scarcity through competition. The transition wouldn't be easy or painless. Wealthy individuals and powerful corporations benefit enormously from current economic arrangements and will resist any changes that threaten their advantages. Political systems designed to protect capital accumulation won't voluntarily transform into systems designed to protect human welfare and environmental sustainability. But the historical Jesus faced similar obstacles. The Roman Empire was the ancient world's most powerful military and economic force, yet Jesus proclaimed a kingdom that would ultimately outlast every earthly empire. He was executed as a political criminal, yet his movement continued to grow and eventually transformed the entire Mediterranean world. The early Christians didn't overcome Roman power through political compromise or gradual reform. They created alternative communities that demonstrated different ways of organizing human relationships. These communities eventually became so attractive that even emperors wanted to join them. Perhaps the most important lesson from this history is that systemic change often begins with small groups of people who take countercultural values seriously enough to reorganize their lives around them. The question for modern Christians isn't whether they can reform capitalism from within. It's whether they're willing to experiment with alternatives that more closely reflect Jesus' actual teachings. This experiment would require sacrifices that few are prepared to make. It means choosing relationships over profits, sustainability over growth, cooperation over competition, and community welfare over individual accumulation. It means accepting that following Jesus might cost you money, status, and conventional success. But it also offers something that capitalist culture cannot provide: the possibility of human relationships that aren't distorted by market calculations, work that serves human needs rather than profit margins, and economic security based on community solidarity rather than individual competition. The irony is profound. Christianity provided crucial cultural foundations for the development of modern capitalism, yet Jesus' actual teachings offer one of the most radical critiques of capitalist assumptions available in human history. Contemporary Christians face a choice that their ancestors avoided through theological creativity and selective interpretation. They can continue explaining away Jesus' economic teachings while participating fully in capitalist culture, or they can take those teachings seriously and begin experimenting with economic alternatives that embody kingdom values. The historical record suggests that Jesus would view modern capitalism much as he viewed the money changers in the temple, as a system that exploits God's children while claiming divine blessing. His response wouldn't be gradual reform or ethical guidelines for better business practices. It would be overturning the tables and declaring that his Father's house is not a marketplace. The question isn't whether Jesus would approve of modern capitalism. The evidence overwhelmingly suggests he would not. The question is whether modern Christians are prepared to take his disapproval seriously enough to imagine and create economic alternatives that prioritize love of God and neighbor over love of money. 2,000 years after a carpenter's son challenged the economic powers of his day, his followers still wrestle with the same fundamental question: can you serve both God and mammon? Jesus' answer remains as clear and challenging as ever. You cannot serve two masters. The choice has never been more urgent. In a world facing climate collapse, extreme inequality, and widespread economic insecurity, the need for alternatives to profit-driven capitalism has never been greater. Whether Christians will rediscover their founder's revolutionary economic vision or continue baptizing systems he would have opposed may determine not just the future of Christianity, but the future of human civilization itself. The carpenter from Nazareth is still waiting for his followers to take him at his word.